questions you want to have on broadcast live?
Heather needs to be here, and I made these just for Heather because I felt bad.
Yeah,
She did say that.
I made her feel
Okay. Hello.
Yeah, we're gonna lose these.
I can say Brendan. I went to Jersey with him and his family.
I don't know if he.
Boys and girls. It's a cookie. It's a cookie. Yeah. Thou shalt not. I'll explain.
Right.
Anyway, as proof that miracles do happen, once again, we acquired the allotted amount of money that we requested last August today, which means that we now have money. Pizza. Yeah. No, this amount, and I also completed the application for this semester, so if it's like last semester, we'll get it during the summer. But we have 2 events coming up, so we're covered on the events. We don't have to worry about it, even if we have to use last semester's money. Okay, so we're good on events. Mark will have a poster for us next week that hopefully you all will help us share throughout campus. This guy, he's got a doctorate. He's not silly. The what is it? Title, the name of the event, whatever. God is a genocidal bully should attract people just based on a title. However, it's on a Friday night at a commuter campus. So invite your church, invite your friends. I'm sorry? The 16th of February. 2 weeks, a little bit over 2 weeks.
3 weeks from tomorrow.
3 weeks from tomorrow.
These women are going to be on women's retreat, so
I'm sure. Regardless, invite somebody or tell them about it. You'll have plenty of posters. Gift the poster to someone. Flyer is probably a better term for that. Whatever, as far as that goes.
Who designs our material?
No. That's a national.
Oh, this is a national poster. Yeah, he just fixed. And then I have notes on the back.
I was going to say, I will do that.
I have notes on the back.
Yeah, you got somebody else who can do it too now.
Outstanding.
Volunteer,
Hey, here's where I need your help
too. Signage.
Not that, you probably really care. If you happen to look at my Facebook page, which most of you probably don't, I am now the regional director over Ratio Christi in West Virginia. Woo-hoo. That means that I support. I'm supposed to support other Ratio Christi chapters throughout the state, which consists of 1. There's only 2 in the entire state. Herein lies where your help comes in. If you know somebody in the Morgantown area or somebody in Charleston or Huntington that want to drive that far, I need chapter directors.
There aren't Christians in Morgantown.
Well, see, I didn't say that loud. The good thing and the reason I started with Morgantown is that they are a recognized chapter already because a couple of guys tried to do it and they did a good job. However, one graduated and one's working. So it's already organized as far as the university goes. We need a chapter director and some students. That's how hard that would be. Any other college in the state, one of y'all asked me about West Virginia State. Fantastic. We'll go anywhere, whether it's a community college, West Virginia, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I'll leave it at that.
Sorry.
So,
Heather.
Seriously, if you know students at other schools, University of Charleston's probably not a good option because I tried that once upon a time. But if you can get us in there, praise the Lord, we'll go. Go.
I'm from Morgantown, so I can start trying to work on that.
That's good. I have two girls.
I'm from
I don't
St. Albans.
personally have two girls. I know two girls that go to Morgantown, which maybe, I don't know, maybe we'll work something out. Just keep that going around.
I'm from St. Albans, so I can find people for a state.
Even better.
And state,
You and Kelby.
really good gambling.
Kelby's not here.
People that go to state too, she can help out.
I know a crap ton of people everywhere, so.
Yeah, that's why Heather is our media director.
What is your job?
Yeah, she's our event coordinator. You watch and see.
She knows everybody.
That's going to entail when we have Dr. Morrow here on the 16th, she'll have 30 people minimum lined up to go.
I won't be there, but I'll have people there.
See? And when we give away hot dogs and have a band outside in May, she'll be there.
I mean, what?
All right. Regional director starting in Ratio Christi clubs. I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about that.
You're only
I touched on.
You get peanut
I touched on our event. Y'all make this really hard.
Okay, guys. Okay.
I touched on our event we're having in February that most of you have no idea who Jonathan Morrow is and appear that you don't really care. But the big argument is the God of the Old Testament versus the lovey Santa Claus Jesus in the New Testament appear to be two different people. So he's going to answer those type questions. Well, God wiped out all these people. How can he not be in charge of evil and all this kind of stuff? The guy's a genius. Google him. It's free. I'm going to skip those other things because they involve things that I have. Oh, one thing about me. If you're bored and want to drive to Scott Depot, which is 30 minutes from here, 6:30 on Sunday evenings, there will be a class. You've not missed anything because we've only had one class and it explained what apologetics is. So this week we will start something else, but anyway, it's on guard. If you want to get the book, it's an Amazon cheap. Speaking of, is that all I had? That's all I had. Do you have anything? I got him. All right. I told the young man that I'm about to introduce, which the only thing I know him by is Taylor. I met him last week. It's a miracle I knew that his name was Taylor, because as you all know, I know none of your names. But he's starting a new fraternity on campus, looking for.
All you're the dude that's been standing down there all week.
Yeah.
Yeah, little mini golf thingy.
Yeah.
What more of an introduction does he need? The little dude that stands down the stairs. Anyway, I told him I'd give him a few minutes to tell you about what he's doing. Following Taylor, because I'm not coming back up here till the end, we're going to start week 1 of a 4-week session on cold case Christianity. It's a highly recommended book to anyone. I don't care if we're doing the study or not. If you need something to read, get Cold Case Christianity. J. Warner Wallace, you can get it on Kindle cheap. You can get it for probably $10 in paperback. Okay? Mark's going to do this for the next 4 weeks. You don't have to listen to me. With that being said, Taylor, the guy that's downstairs typically.
It plays golf. Yeah.
Plays mini golf.
No, Heather's got it.
What's your cord? Taylor knocked over our live feed at one point already.
Oh, I know, I saw.
That's what John said. My name is Taylor. I'm with Lambda Chi Alpha. I'm an educational leadership consultant starting a new fraternity on campus this semester. We're focusing a little bit more on leadership opportunities. We're at about 197 or 198 campuses at this point. And so the reason that I'm here is I'm just kind of looking for a little bit of help. We're trying to reach out a little bit more to give a little more of a face to name, but as well just like for opportunities for gentlemen that may be interested, as well as anyone else that you may know on campus that may be interested in this opportunity as well. We're focusing on service and personal and professional development a little bit more. So we're trying to pair up with the food bank that's in Huntington because we're partnered with Feeding America as an international organization. We're also trying to have several of the alumni that we have work on campus as professors and faculty and staff to help out with the undergraduates and basically helping teach them stuff you don't learn in class. So things like resume building or like budgeting, stuff like that, that you don't necessarily get the opportunity to learn in between books. But yeah, that's pretty much why I'm here. And then I'm going to leave some contact info with John. So if y'all ever want to get a hold of me or reach out, or if you know some people that may be interested or want to come play some putt-putt downstairs, just let me know. But if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them if you have. Otherwise.
I told him we normally have.
That's it. That's okay.
I told him we normally have 5 to 7 guys. And I didn't mean
Which fair? Talkies are very high.
Hey, if you want to come to crew
Yeah.
after this, we have a crap ton of guys, so.
And Heather will make it happen.
Listen, I don't like everyone, so follow me. Okay.
All right, I will email you.
Yes, somebody needs to pray. You may want to pray
Thanks,
first
Taylor.
tonight before we get started. Somebody pray. Anyway,
I think Sean should pray.
Sean should pray.
Sean should pray.
Since you had to leave, you need to pray.
Yeah, you sinner.
No excuse.
Scrub.
Thank you God for letting us have this meeting and just help us learn more about how to defend your word and defend who you are. That's your name. Amen.
All right, good evening, everybody. By the way, if you want to make plans for the National Conference on Christian Apologetics, all the way in October, 12th and 13th, I've found out the keynote speaker this year is Ravi Zacharias. So if you want to go ahead and make plans now, 25th anniversary. There you go.
I must attend
Great.
this meeting.
All right, tonight we're going to start. Here's what's going on. I have 4 video segments, one of which I will play every week at the end of the PowerPoint presentation. It is each video corresponds to either chapter 11, 12, 13, or 14 in Cold Case Christianity, which is the summary of the first section of the book. But because these are bits of his presentation that are completely stripped out of context, I've created PowerPoints to let you know what's going on in advance of what we watch in the videos. And so I presented this at my church over the summer. There's an optional 5th week in which we study something completely unrelated. But that being said, I do have, all right, here's the basis for why we're going to study this stuff. First off, to clear up wrong information circulates about how we got the Bible. Contrary to popular opinion in rural West Virginia, it did not drop out of the sky in Shakespearean English. All right. All right, to make your toolkit for talking with others a little larger, so you might not be caught off guard as much by some of the stuff people come up with. And finally, this is an extensive command through the New Testament. We are to grow in knowledge and wisdom.
And I wish I could stay beside of you and just make comments.
Yes,
As you went.
I know, because all this is going to raise
You can
stuff.
make the roof track later.
If people actually do pick up the text and engage it, you're really not allowed to be a pew sitter the rest of your life. I mean, we are obligated. That's my gripe, is Jesus is fire insurance, where people accept him and then go about their lives, or feel they have accepted him, however your perspective is. So anyway, I am having a 5-minute Bible study tonight due to time constraints, as opposed to 7 minutes like last week. We're going to look at 4 verses from our trusty Sword of the Lord, and it is better known as the case of the missing question mark. So here you have the Hardy Boys at the Dead Sea, and here's the caves of Qumran with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Never mind.
See, they have no idea.
I know, it's okay. It's okay.
Maybe we are happy.
You guys haven't read this back in grade school? All right.
Well, I can see you're using the King
This is
James.
my attempt at humor tonight, so just bear with me. All right. The case of the missing question mark. All right, I'm going to ask you to just hold with me, track with me for just a few minutes here. Okay. We're in John chapter 4. This is the woman at the well. It says, "Now Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being wearied with his journey, sat thus on the well. And it was about the 6th hour. There cometh a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus saith unto her, Give me to drink. For his disciples were gone away into the city to buy meat. Then saith the woman of Samaria unto him, How is it that thou, being a Jew, askest drink of me, which am a woman of Samaria? For the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans." Now, how many of you have heard a sermon or lesson taught on this passage? Yeah, most of you have. I kind of figured. And usually what's the gist of it? Who does the woman at the well typically represent in these stories? You and me, right? And we're so worthless and blah, blah, blah. Okay. This will give you a completely different perspective on what's going on. Because if you notice, first off, Jesus sounds bossy here. And this bugged me when I was a teenager in church. Because that sure wasn't the Jesus that got talked about in Sunday school. Now, something similar is going on here at the wedding at Cana. Because how does Jesus refer to Mary? Woman. We can talk about something blunt. He just calls her. But here's the problem. That's when we try to read our modern understanding backwards 2,000 years into the text. That's when we get in trouble. Because if it's, okay, give me to drink. Okay. But notice what she says. You ask us drink of me. So where's the question mark? If he's asking, yet he sounds like a caveman here, unfortunately, with the way it's rendered. Give me to drink.
It's because it was written by me and over and over and over.
Just saying, where is this mysterious question mark? All right. Actually, here's what's happening there. And this took me, I wondered about this in my early teens, and it took me nearly 30 years in a graduate degree to figure out what's going on. And now I know, and I can share it with you guys. Is Jesus being bossy? Is there a problem in the original Greek text? Is it a typesetting error in modern in our contemporary time? Is it sloppiness by the translators? It's actually none of the above. There's something else going on here. Okay. Unfortunately, in this region of the country and elsewhere, there's a belief that translation is simply replacing the Greek word with the appropriate English word and you're good to go. Okay, that is the problem in this neck of the woods. That's not how translations work, especially bringing Koine Greek into English, because it's hard to do. And it's hard to do for two reasons. Okay? And so this quirk has occurred because the translators are trying to do their best by being as literal without losing the meaning. Okay? And here's what I mean. There's two things going on with Greek that are vastly different than English. Greek is inflected, meaning that the syntax is not dependent on word order. Okay, you have your subjects, you have your verbs, you have your objects. In Greek, the subject is typically in the middle of the sentence and the object's usually at the beginning. So it has nothing to do with word order in the sentence. It has everything to do with how it is inflected in its word ending. If there's a man saying and doing something, let's say the man picked up his mat, that's going to have the masculine word ending on all of those components in the syntax. You'll have a masculine ending on man, you'll have a masculine ending on picked up, and you'll have a masculine ending on his mat. And so it's by these inflections which we don't have in English, in which this stuff comes into our language. Secondly, our verbs typically describe time, past tense, current, future. Greek verbs do not discuss time. They discuss aspect. An aspect is the nature of the action that is taking place. And that is why you'll see the little word be, a helper word, in English, but it makes it really easy for us to see when that goes on, because whenever you read about someone's being made righteous in Christ, it's always past tense. That's the way it comes into English. You have been made righteous. It's always past tense. Okay? So this is how it affects in the meaning. Plus, there's no word for please in Greek. See, that's why I thought as a kid Jesus sounded bossy, because he didn't say please. And remember, if you grew up watching Mr. Cartoon, which I doubt you guys did, he's a little before your time, please was one of the magic words. You always said please, thank you, and you're welcome. So there's no word for please in Greek, which adds to the whole thing. Which means if you go through and read a modern translation of this passage, you'll see many times the word please added. Now, are they adding to the original Greek? Or are they being less wooden and literal and giving meaning to the passage which can't come through to the English? See, these are the issues that translators, and we're just talking about one little sentence in one little part of the whole New Testament. And it's this way through the whole New Testament. So it's implied in the syntax, but here's what's going on to wrap it up, okay? It is a type of command. It is a command, but it's a special type. It's a type that doesn't occur very often. It's called an entreaty. And this is where the cool part of the story is, okay? You get nothing else. When we pray to God, we're entreating him. Because an entreaty is the act of a request from one person who lacks something to another person who has what the first person desires. In other words, someone who has nothing is asking something of someone who has it. It's an entreaty. It's an act of humility. Okay? It's a humbling act. So here's the moral of the story. Jesus humbled himself to a woman that religion and society viewed as worthless. Okay? You guys know the rest of the story. You've heard it preached to you. She came to the well in the middle of the day. She was with a man who didn't have her husband. And worst of all, she's a Samaritan, because they are sort of these half-Jews. We don't have time to go back into Kings to show you where that happened. What's the end result of Jesus making himself less than this woman? What's the positive result that he models for us? By humbling himself to her, what happened to him? He was glorified. The people got saved that day. Okay? They came to acknowledge him as Messiah because he humbled himself to her. So, anytime that your emotions get the better of what you know to be the truth, and you may feel worthless or down, remember, okay, she mattered to Jesus. You matter to him too. Okay? And he was willing to humble himself to her. So don't forget that. Okay? This is where the heart of the story lies. It's his act to her, and what was the result? Great things happened that day. Because he set aside what could have been to reach out to someone who needed to hear it. All right. There's our moral of the story. That's why there's no question mark. It's not inaccurate. Okay? It's not inaccurate. It's not wrong. In fact, the King James is as literal as you can be, and it's translated properly. So if you look at newer translations, you take the time to look at that verse, you'll see they all struggle trying to translate that verse. All of them do. Because there's no easy way to bring it into English. Okay? That took me 30 years to figure out those last few minutes there, so I should pick a different hobby, I think, by this one. All right, here's our basic question in tonight's class. When were the Gospels written? Okay, we have a number of events here. Somewhere around the year 33, maybe the year 30. Some people would even say later. Jesus was crucified, buried, resurrected, and ascended. Okay? Around the year 364 was the Council of Laodicea. And this is why this particular council is significant, is because it is the first of the church councils to compare notes and come up with a list. Their list consisted of 26 books that they felt were inspired for the New Testament. So if the Gospels are written somewhere between, say, 30 AD and 100 AD, we can know that they're written by eyewitnesses. However, if they're written much later, then it goes without saying they can't be eyewitness accounts. So how can we date the Gospels, and what do we have to show that they are early, which is our view? Okay, so why are these eyewitnesses important? Actually, it occurs a vast number of times in the New Testament. Okay, there's lots of references to what people have seen. Okay, in John 1:34, and I saw and bear record that this is the Son of God. We have a theme of John, isn't it? Now, this statement is actually inflammatory, especially from an early Jewish perspective, even from a current Jewish perspective. Because John is going on record saying, this man is divine. And that's heresy unless it's the truth. Now, it's blasphemous unless it's the truth that Jesus really is divine. Because remember, we studied last week in Deuteronomy, God is one. And Isaiah goes as far to say there's nobody else. But you have these comments all through the New Testament. This is what we saw. You know, all we can go on is our senses. We saw him. We ate fish with him. We touched our fingers in the side. We heard what he had to say after he was raised from the dead. Okay. Based on what these eyewitnesses' senses told them about the world around them, they were willing to go on record, okay, which meant this is almost an automatic death sentence. It's almost an automatic death sentence because they're hanging it out there and they are admitting, and here they are testifying that this Jesus of Nazareth is divine, which separates them from Judaism. Okay? It separates them from Judaism. They're taking a stand and they are rejecting the tenets of Judaism. Okay? So the next 4 weeks, tonight were the eyewitnesses present. Next week, can they be verified? Can we really test to see if they are who they are and if they're verifiable? Were they honest or were they biased? How often do you hear biased from people who say that the people who wrote the Gospels? There's something to be said about that. Bias isn't as important as people make it out to be. And then if you guys want to do a 5th week, we can do something a little unrelated. It's kind of like a little Bible thing we look through. All right. Jim Wallace came here to Marshall, 4 years ago? It was after Frank, wasn't it? 3? So he has spoken on behalf of this group. He was an atheist until he was 34 years old, until he studied the details of the Gospels. He'll go into a little bit of his background tonight on our video. This is his latest book. I haven't made it all the way through this one. I've taught this to the high school students in my church, and I've taught this a couple times at the church. So as a detective, as an atheist detective, he used his cold case skills to examine the gospel accounts to see if they really are eyewitness testimony. He's been on Dateline quite a few times covering cold cases, usually with Keith Morrison doing the interviewing. And he did it so he could disprove the truth of the Gospels. Well, guess what happened the more he started to look? Okay? And such is the nature of the word. Now he is an adjunct professor occasionally at various seminaries around the country. Okay? Because he believed that the Gospels were written long after, because that's what people repeat on YouTube. It's what atheists repeat to each other to keep their pillows warm at night, I guess. Okay? So I have to give a little time out here. No Snickers from the peanut gallery. All right, so what do we mean by written late? So we take this conservative view, the same view that you guys have always heard in church growing up. We also view them as historically accurate. They're not made up. Then we view them as written specifically by an apostle or one of their associates. Okay? However, you'll hear this man's name quite a bit if you hang around this group. Okay, if you have a New Testament class at Marshall or somewhere else.
This is the dude that wrote our book.
Yeah, I know.
This is an earlier version of the book. Yep. Now hold that thought for a minute, okay? Now here's his background. Okay, what book is it for what class? Tell everybody what you're talking about.
The brief introduction to the New Testament.
Your New Testament class book was written by an atheist agnostic.
And I had a book called Jesus Interrupted, also by that.
Oh
Right.
yeah, I've heard.
Right.
I've heard.
Yeah, I've got that one too.
His-
I've taken both his classes.
And this is his testimony right here, okay? We're about to read his testimony. He says he got saved as a teen. He went to Moody Bible Institute.
Oh, that's a great name.
He went to Wheaton College.
That's a person, D.L. Moody.
I just caught what she was saying.
Yeah. Quick on the draw there, brother. Princeton is the home of Bruce Metzger, who's written various New Testament studies books that most seminaries use.
He's Bart Ehrman's daddy.
However,
He is.
Bruce Metzger is not atheist agnostic.
Oh, yeah.
They're agnostic. He's written several books.
Oh.
He brings a book out about every year.
Oh, great.
Recently, he caused minor waves because he finally admitted that Jesus is portrayed as divine in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke. But the problem is he believes that Jesus lived. He believes that Jesus actually did live. He's not a Christ myther. And so all the people who believe that Jesus didn't live don't like him for that fact. But all the evangelicals rush to that to say that, hey, even Bart Ehrman believes that Jesus lived. Then we have these other books. My brother thought it would be good if I had this. Gospel of Judas. In the Gospel of Judas, which is late, probably around the beginning, probably around the beginning of the 3rd century, comes out of Egypt. In the Gospel of Judas, Judas was the only one of the 12 who got it right. The other 11 got it wrong. That's why Judas had to die, pretty much. Because he had the special knowledge to see who Jesus was. There are a number of books that are not in the Bible for a number of reasons. You have Gospels of Mary, Peter, Thomas, Judas. You have Q, which you'll hear people bring up once in a while, which just, it's German for Quella. It just means source. There's some people who believe that the Gospels are based on earlier sources like Q, and a source called the Passion Narrative that predates Mark, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We'll get into that. You got your canon, which is the official list, let's say, of 27 books. The word canon simply means measuring stick or measuring reed. It's what's accepted as genuine. This is where you'll hear atheists claim that Constantine was responsible, or that one of the later councils handpicked these books. So the Council of Laodicea was a regional meeting 330 years after Jesus was crucified. And so they agreed on 26 I forget which one was it Revelation, remember? It's either Revelation or James or Jude or one of the little ones in the back. Based on the following criteria, written by an apostle or his close associate. But here's the three major events. This is my view that helped shape Christianity as we know it. Kind of kicked it in the butt a little bit. You have the destruction of the temple in the year 69 or 70. Is this ever mentioned in the Bible?
Yes.
No.
Not as an event. It's prophesied, but the actual event itself is not mentioned. And we're not. The actual destruction. That's an important distinction. I know what you're thinking because Jesus spoke about it.
He said that would be fun.
Once the last of the apostles died out is when you start seeing books like this written. This is I have got a bad feeling about this in the words of every person in Star Wars. Up until this time, Christianity was persecuted. Constantine, however, saw value in making it legal. There was a rough patch in the Roman Empire. So he makes Christianity legal and forces his soldiers to convert. So now you've got politics and Christianity coming together in an empire, which is a really scary idea. But we're stuck with it. So over the coming weeks, we'll talk a bit more about the canon. We'll talk a bit more about Constantine. Talk a little bit more about the destruction of Jerusalem. And my favorite subject of all, which atheists never seem to study because it would set them straight quite a bit, the church fathers. As Jesus had disciples, the disciples had disciples. Okay? We know them as the church fathers. We have a great deal of the writings. As a matter of fact, the writings of the church fathers take the equivalent of 3 sets of encyclopedias. Okay, they wrote a lot. One guy wrote several letters. Ignatius wrote letters around 80, 85 AD, and they predate the book of Revelation. And we have chunks of them. Okay, but he's not an eyewitness, so his letters are not considered part of the Bible. Okay, the movie Polycarp is now on Amazon this month. It's a book about this guy's life. He was a disciple of the Apostle John. It's kind of a fictionalized account of Polycarp's life, but it's an excellent film. So Polycarp had his disciples. So now this is 3rd generation away from one of the apostles who saw Jesus alive. But look what Irenaeus had to write. This is one of my favorite quotes from the church fathers. Matthew issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own dialect while Peter and Paul were preaching at Rome and laying the foundations of the church. After their departure, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, also did hand down to us in writing what had been preached to Peter. So now we've got Matthew and Mark. He says they wrote the gospels that bear their names. Luke also, companion of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel preached by him. So now we've got Matthew, Mark, and Luke being admitted as gospels at 180 AD. Afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who also leaned upon his breast, did himself publish a gospel during his residence at Ephesus. So here we've got all 4 gospels, which atheists to this day swear are anonymous. And here we've got one of the disciples of the disciples telling us they're not anonymous. The people whose names are on them, that's who wrote them. But the thing that intrigues me, he says that Matthew was written in Hebrew. We don't have a copy of Matthew in Hebrew. All we have is the Greek version of Matthew. So according to Irenaeus, they had to be before 180. Okay, so this idea that they're late. So this reminds me of that scene in the original Star Wars where Han Solo comes out of the sun to shoot one of Darth Vader's henchmen and throw him off into. It's just like right out of left field, here he comes saying, look, this is what's on there. So according to Irenaeus, they're written before here, which is a long way away from here. And we're getting ready to watch our video, and this is what Jim Walls talks about. So talk amongst yourselves for 30 seconds, and I'll get this up and running.
Yeah. We were like, where is Heather?
All right. Fast.
30 seconds for the.
When we're evaluating witnesses, we test them. And we test them in trial by allowing our jurors to think of about 14 questions in California they can ask in their mind to assess an eyewitness on the stand. And they break down into these 4 categories. But to make it easy, I'll give it to you in simple words. If a witness qualifies in these 4 large areas, we are to consider them reliable. And we're going to look at those this morning, and we're going to build a circumstantial case to support each of these points. So I need to teach you about circumstantial evidence first, right? Let's start at the very beginning, because my big objections as a 34-year-old guy who was willing to go with my wife to church if she wants to go to church, I'm happy to go as a non-believer. My dad's been doing that for 73 years. No problem. I can do that too. But that first day I sat down, my first time in an evangelical church, right? And I sat down, the pastor was talking about Jesus as a smart guy. I was 35. I thought, well, he's smart. I'm willing to listen. Just to the words, the proverbial wisdom of an ancient sage like Buddha or Baha'u'llah or Socrates. No problem. I can put Jesus in that box. But as I read through the Gospels to get the red letters out, I recognized attributes of eyewitness statements that I see in my work every day. And that got me started. But I had 2 big hurdles. I did not believe that those Gospels could have been written early enough because they included miraculous events. And if you're going to write those early, people who were really there would know it's a lie. So they have to have been written very late. And that's the first question under consideration. Was the witness really there when he said he was? I put this article on the wall. This is a newspaper article of my dad back in 1974, February 21st, 1974. My dad's this guy here who says he hates this picture because it makes him look like a greasy polyester detective in the 70s. Because he was a greasy polyester detective in the 70s. I remember when he bought that suit, so I know exactly what his whole story is, okay? So, but the point is, we're walking this suspect here. 2 other detectives here and here are walking the suspect back to court. This suspect has been accused of killing a 10-year-old girl on Thanksgiving Day in 1972. She vanished from her house or her neighborhood. She was dropped off the rocks in Oxnard, 2 counties north of us. And this gentleman confessed in about 1,000 pages of transcripts of the most incredibly detailed, gruesome account of what he did to her. And none of it is true. He wasn't even there. Did he have some issues? Yeah, he had some issues. He loved the attention he was getting from those 2 detectives who were talking to him for 4 months. He was the center of all of our world for those 4 months. But we eliminated him on the eve of the trial by some blood evidence. And then by that time, we were about 16 months behind the murder. It's been cold ever since. So I thought this Terry Lynn Hollis was a name that the entire nation knew. No, it was just a name that my dad knew because he had been working this thing obsessively for 5 years. If someone's not present, they can't be the killer. Also, if they're not present, they can't be an eyewitness. So we have to ask this question of the gospel authors. We have an event in the past, the ministry of Jesus, and we have a time in the history in which the early Christians made a claim about what was a reliable eyewitness account. It's a church council known as the Council of Laodicea. It's the first council where people said, hey, you can trust that eyewitness account, and you can trust that eyewitness account, but the Gospel of Thomas, no, that's late. Gospel of Philip, no, that's late. Gospel of Mary, no, that's late. And they started tossing out the non-canonicals. But how do we know when the actual eyewitnesses, or the alleged eyewitnesses, actually wrote the Gospels? If they wrote the Gospels down at this end of the timeline, you really shouldn't trust them. They're too late to be eyewitness accounts. They're written in the 3rd century. Come on, guys. Since there's nobody around who still would know. Now, there's lots of folks who are doing important work who would, I think, advocate for a position such as this. Like Bart Ehrman, who's written a number of books really trying to convince people that the version of Christianity we have today really isn't necessarily the true one. It's just the one that won. There's lots of lost Christianities that no one even pays attention to anymore. And you really can't trust that we know what Jesus said, because most of Jesus' words have been redacted, or there's so many variants between the texts, you can't really trust any of it. And finally, you can't even trust that the people whose names are on those books are actually the people who wrote them, because they've all been forged. If, though, the authors, by the way, Bart Ehrman, raised in the church, Moody Bible Institute, Wheaton College, studied under Bruce Metzger, probably one of the finest biblical scholars in the 20th century at Princeton Seminary, not a believer. And he's one of the most influential, well-read biblical authorities in the North American continent. And young people, when they go to college, they're probably going to be introduced to Bart Ehrman. And they're not going to know the truth before they get there.
Sorry.
So that's what we're going to do this morning. If this is true, and they're written late, we should discard them. On the other hand, if they're written down toward this end of the timeline, they can at least pass the first test. They were present. Doesn't mean they're telling the truth, but they're lying early. And it's hard to lie early. All right. So how do we know when this was actually? I think there's good circumstantial case you can build for early dating. So here we are. Bible scholars, Sunday school graduates, here we go. What's the one book in the Bible in which the first century after the ascension of Jesus is described? Book of Acts. Very good. Thank you. In the book of Acts, where do you hear about the destruction of the temple? You know, the temple was destroyed right around 70 AD, according to historians, not Christians. So where in the book of Acts do they describe the destruction of the temple? Remember, this is a horrific event preceded by several years by a siege of Jerusalem, in which they blockaded the city, starved everyone who was in there, and eventually knocked down the walls and destroyed the temple. Now, I would think it would be in there, in the book of Acts. After all, Jesus is going to predict it in Matthew 23. Does Luke include it in the book of Acts? No. There's no New Testament book that includes either the siege or the destruction of the temple. How about this? At the end of the book of Acts, is Paul alive or dead? Come on, graduates. This is the audience participation part of the actual service. He's alive. He's in custody in Rome. But we know he's martyred between 64 and 67. Why is he still alive at the end of the book of Acts? Why is Peter still alive? He's also martyred about the same time. And James, the brother of Jesus, is martyred in 61. That's not mentioned in the book of Acts. Now think about it for a second. Why would these things be missing from the book of Acts? Can you think of a good reason why these 5 events, well, you have 4, there's actually Peter's death is here too. Why would these be missing from the book of Acts? Hadn't happened yet. So I will just place Luke's authorship just 1 year ahead of the first missing event. That's just modest. I could place it 10 years ahead of the first missing event, right? But I'm just going to place it 1 year ahead of it. Now, he wrote 2 books, right? Luke wrote what books? He wrote the book of Acts and what else? Gospel of Luke. And he wrote the Gospel of Luke before the book of Acts. We know that because in the first verse of the book of Acts it says, in my former book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and teach, verse 2, until he was taken up to heaven. So we know that Luke comes before Acts. I place it as early as 53. Why do I place it at 53? Because I think there's good internal evidence. So let's go to Paul. Paul's going to write to Timothy in 1 Timothy 5. And he says, the elders who direct the affairs of the church are well worthy of double honor. And he says, for the scripture says, and I love seeing that as a skeptic, because I want to know, what did these first century Christians think scripture is? How early is it showing up? Well, he quotes 2 verses. Do not muzzle the ox while it's treading out the grain is from Deuteronomy. So he's got an Old Testament verse there. But the second verse, and the worker deserves his wages. Where is that from? That he's not quoting out of the Old Testament. He's quoting that out of the New Testament. That is out of the Gospel of Luke. So now we have Paul as early as 63 quoting the Gospel of Luke to Timothy, who either knows, he must already know that it's the Gospel, he must already know it is Scripture, because I don't think Paul's saying for the first time, and by the way, Timothy, this is Scripture. He's just identifying it. Now, I'll be honest, Bart Ehrman does not accept 1 Timothy as a Pauline book. Okay. There's a bigger problem, because even before this book, in 1 Corinthians, which is written at 57 to 53, 57 AD, it's a much earlier book, Paul does something very similar. In this, he says, he's going to quote Remember, the Corinthians are having problems. They're not celebrating the Lord's Supper properly. They're always messing it up. They're not respectful. They're doing all kinds of things they shouldn't do. So Paul says, remember how you're supposed to do this, folks. And he goes back and he recites the Lord Jesus on the night he was betrayed. He took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Well, if you read through all the Gospels, looking at the Lord's Supper, you'll see that every Gospel author includes it, but only one says that Jesus said, do this in remembrance of me. It's not Mark, it's not Matthew, it's not John. Here, Paul once again is quoting directly from the Gospel of Luke. He's quoting chapter 22. He's quoting it to a group to remind them to return to something they already know, and he's quoting it as early as 53 to 57. How much earlier did they already know this? How long has this been canonized as Scripture? It must have been pretty early, because he's asking them to return to it. So that's why I think it's reasonable for us to place the Gospel of Luke right around 53. That's modest, because I'm placing it pretty close to the actual time of this writing. Now, what I thought was really fascinating about the Gospel of Luke, and I had been trained in forensic statement analysis before I came on before I even looked at the Gospels. And in forensic statement analysis, we examine the written statements of suspects. And we're examining them for their use of certain language of deception. We're also examining for their use of pronouns, for their verb tenses, for whether they expand time or contract time. I did the same thing with all the Gospels, because I was so interested in their accuracy. And what I noticed in the very first chapter of Luke's Gospel, he says this, many have undertaken to drop an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses. He's not an eyewitness. He's a detective who's talking to the eyewitnesses and writing it down. And he tells Theophilus, the same guy he was talking to in the book of Acts, he says, I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning. It seemed good also to me to write an orderly account. Why would he say an order? Look, if I'm going to write a supplemental report about a crime, you can be sure it's going to be orderly, duh. But he makes a point of saying his is orderly. Why? I think I know. In the first century, a bishop named Papias says that Mark was scribing for Peter when he was writing the Gospel of Mark. That Mark's Gospel is simply the teaching of Peter in Rome, teaching everyone about what he experienced with Jesus. And that Mark is writing everything Jesus says. And Papias says in the first century that Mark was being very careful about accuracy, but not that careful about order. Now Luke says, I'm giving you an orderly account, Theophilus. And who's the one person he quotes word for word more than anyone else? Mark, the disorderly account. It's as if he's saying, I'm giving you Mark's account, but I've added stuff that he didn't add, and I've also done it in the right order. That means that Mark's account has to exist prior to Luke's account for him to quote it. And look how close it puts it to the events. Now we're within 10, 15 years of the actual events. Not only could they have been young enough and actually have lived to have seen this stuff, but they have to write it at a time when others who would have known better can say, time out. That never happened. I know Jesus. He never did that stuff. If you're writing early, it's harder to lie.
Yep. All right. Any thoughts or questions or anything? Yes, sir.
Okay, so the one in 1 Corinthians.
Yes.
How would you respond to someone who said it wasn't Luke, it was Q, or something along those lines that Paul was quoting?
I would ask what evidence they had for that.
That's a fair question.
Because I mean, they can make that.
What do you mean by that?
Exactly.
They can raise that question. I mean, that's a legitimate question to ask, but they're going to have to back it up.
Yeah.
That's the thing. Now, there could have been a couple other circumstances, but do you guys know what happened to Mark, by the way? What tradition says happened to him? Tradition says that after this, Mark went to Egypt. And tradition says he was martyred by being dragged behind a chariot through the streets, I believe, of Alexandria. They just drug him until he fell apart. So, next week we'll take a little farther. Yes, sir.
Are there any apostles other than John or associates of the apostles who weren't martyred?
According to Fox's Book of Martyrs, which seems to be the standard Christian book of martyrs that everyone goes to, I would say no.
Okay.
As far as historical accounts that can be verified, Sean McDowell's PhD dissertation deals with that. There's only 5 accounts for the apostles that can be historically verified. The rest you kind of have to take with a grain of salt. There are, for example, Polycarp. There's a number of stories about him. Tradition says he was boiled in oil, I believe. So.
He was burned at the stake.
Yeah, burned at the stake, boiled in one of them. Irenaeus, somebody was.
You're still really hot, I mean.
Yep.
Kelsey?
So,
Before you leave.
all right. Yes, sir.
What about, so, and of course, I don't know Greek or Hebrew, so I couldn't attest.
Or whether
So.
the
so-
temple was in Acts, but go ahead.
Temple wasn't in Acts, I knew that.
Okay.
So what I've heard is that the Gospel of Matthew does not read like a translation. So, I don't know.
That may be correct. I mean, that's the best I could do right there. Because there is a backwards engineered Hebrew version you can buy at Amazon. That's highly controversial.
Interesting.
But there are, one of the things that might lend to that, there are an unusual amount of parenthetical comments within that gospel about Hebrew words that Matthew attempts to explain.
I would like to see it like compared to something like the Septuagint, which would be an example of what something translated from Hebrew to Greek would look like.
Yes.
So,
Good point. Anything else? Okay, thank you, everybody.
You thought you were finished with me. I did say I wasn't coming back, but I am, because I can't stand it. I want to be the color commentator while Mark presents. There's so many things. People will say, why do we need to know this stuff? Well, because if you go out on the street, if you're talking to anyone and they say, Gospels contradict, I don't believe the Gospels. Every objection that's been presented thus far, what are you going to say? Have faith. And they say, do you know that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are anonymous? Most Christians have never heard that they are anonymous. You have now heard that and have a way to refute it. That's why we're doing this. That's why it's so important to know what you believe and why you believe it. Because if you are talking to anyone, if you say, well, that Jesus guy just loves everybody and life's good and we're all going to heaven. They're going to say, they're going to say,
you've been kind of scary today.
Because I woke up late.
Yeah, it's true.
they're going to say, how do you know that? Why do you believe such nonsense? You're sending your students, parents that are watching, and believe it or not, we do have parents watch. How many of you have heard of Bart Ehrman before you came to Marshall? You don't count. Well, exactly. But your children are taking New Testament classes that the professor is using an agnostic atheist textbook teaching New Testament. So, if you don't know these things, and your kids are going to have questions, they're going to come home and tell you that Bart Ehrman said there's over 600,000 variants in the New Testament alone, and there's only 185,000 words. Why would you even believe the New Testament? Because it's not true. Seriously. If all you do is accept what somebody tells you and you don't think apologetics is important, you're not talking to anybody. Other than saying, you want to come to church? They're not going to teach you this stuff in church. not in any church I've ever been in. There are those few. Yeah, I teach a class, Mark teaches a class, Isaac teaches a class. There are those few that have them as extracurricular or activities, I guess, but they're not going to teach it from the pulpit. Maybe I should relay it like that. Anyway, thank you so much for your attention. I hope those that watch got something out of this. The next 3 weeks are going to go a little bit more in depth. Again, this is based on the book Cold Case Christianity. If you want to know why do we believe what we believe based on the Bible, you should probably know if the Bible's true. Or Bart Ehrman may be right. Whoever he may be.
Stop.
All right. I don't have anything else to tell you that I can think of. I can tell you a lot of things, but what time is it?
It is 8:06.
Woo. And we did that all in an hour. Less than an hour.
We did good.
We had a guest and I rattled.
That's like our victory.
It is. That's the closing song.
That's our
Okay,
benediction.
since we're, yeah, can you play Just As I Am? Everybody say bow.
All 7 verses.
Everybody bow your heads. Can I see a hand?
Wait, what are we doing?
Help me to be honest when I say no one's looking around.
We're going to have an altar call. No, I'm kidding. We are not having an altar call.
Yay.
Yeah, well, I had to get that in there. I don't get to color commentate with Mark, so I have to get my
Dude, I'm so tired.
sarcasm in during the closing statement.
Today she missed class.
Excuse me, I'm at 4 a.m.
All right,
Why?
we're done. We're signing off.
I don't like